My name is Diane Williams. I'm 58 years old, and on the evening, my lieutenant stood at a podium and gave a 20-minute speech describing every decision, every lead, every breakthrough in the Morrison case without mentioning my name a single time. I sat at table 4 in a restaurant called Caruso's on 5th and ate chicken marsala and did not say a word. My husband Marcus was beside me. He had been listening to Gerald Harmon speak for 17 minutes at that point. I know because I was watching the clock on the wall above the bar, the one shaped like an Italian coat of arms that I had been staring at since the speech began, because if I looked at the podium, I was going to do something I could not take back. Marcus leaned over once and whispered that Harmon seemed to know the case very well. I said yes, he does. Marcus asked me what my role was in the Morrison investigation. I said I worked the file. He nodded and went back to his chicken. That was the moment I understood something I had been pretending not to know for 30 years. He did not know. My own husband of 26 years had no idea what I had done, what I had found, what I had built over 14 months in that cold case unit while Jerry Harmon was attending departmental luncheons and playing golf with the deputy commissioner. The woman who would change that was already in the building. She was standing near the coat check at the back of Caruso's, wearing a black dress and holding a manila envelope, and she had been trying to find me for 5 years. I joined the department at 28. That was 1996, which means I spent 30 years in various forms of controlled chaos, paperwork, and the specific kind of sadness that comes from knowing what happened to people who never came home. I was not one of those officers who joined because of a calling. I am honest about that. I joined because I had a criminal justice degree, a bad relationship I needed to leave, and a friend at the department who told me they were hiring. My first posting was patrol in the Eastern District, where I spent 4 years learning how fast a night can go wrong and how slow the aftermath moves once it does. I am 5 feet and 6 inches tall, which means every perp I ever took down spent at least 3 seconds underestimating me, and that 3-second window is more useful than people realize. I drove a patrol car for 4 years. I took my detective's exam on a Tuesday morning in 2001, sitting in a classroom at the training center with a cup of gas station coffee and a pen I had borrowed from the woman sitting next to me because I forgot mine. I passed. I moved to general crimes. I spent 7 years in general crimes before I asked to transfer to cold cases. People always want to know why cold cases. The honest answer is not what they expect. It is not because I had a fire for justice or because some unsolved case haunted me from my childhood. The honest answer is that I was tired of competition. General crimes is a department full of people jockeying for the high-profile arrests, the public statements, the press conferences. I was never good at that part. I am good at sitting very still for a long time, looking at the same piece of paper for the 47th time, and noticing the thing that was always there but that nobody saw. Cold cases wanted people like me, or at least I thought they did. It turned out cold cases had the same problem as everywhere else, just quieter. My back started going bad in 2009. I was in pursuit of a vehicle on Route 11 when the driver cut through a gas station lot at about 60 miles per hour and clipped a pump station on his way through, and the debris came across the road and I had to swerve hard. The car spun. I hit a concrete curb with the rear quarter panel going about 40. My seatbelt did its job, but the impact threw me sideways with enough force that 3 vertebrae in my lower back compressed in a way they have never fully recovered from. I spent 6 weeks on restricted duty. I went through physical therapy for 8 months. I wore the compression brace every day for the next 16 years, and I never once mentioned it to my superiors because I did not want it used against me in any performance review. Marcus knew about the brace. He washed it for me when I forgot to. That is about the extent of what he knew about my body's relationship with my job. I transferred to cold cases in 2008, 1 year before the accident. I was given a shared office the size of a reasonable closet, a filing cabinet that stuck at the 3rd drawer, and a caseload of about 40 open investigations, most of which had not been meaningfully touched in years. My partner was a man named Dwight Calloway, who was 2 years from retirement and had the energy of a man 4 years past it. Dwight was not lazy. He was depleted. There is a difference. He had worked cold cases for 11 years and had watched case after case go to trial, conviction, closure, with his name buried at the bottom of the paperwork while supervisors got the press. He was not bitter in a mean way. He was bitter in the way of a man who has run out of reasons to be surprised. He taught me how the unit actually worked. He told me on my 3rd day to document everything in triplicate, and keep a personal copy of every report I filed. I thought he was being dramatic. I filed the personal copies anyway because I did not have a good reason not to. Gerald Harmon became my direct lieutenant in 2014. He transferred in from the Organized Crime Division, where he had built a reputation as a results-driven supervisor, which in practice meant he was skilled at presenting other people's results as evidence of his own leadership. He was not an unintelligent man. He knew law enforcement, he understood procedure, he could read a case file and understand it quickly. What he could not do was sit still long enough to actually work one. His talent was seeing which cases were about to break and positioning himself above them in time to claim credit for the breakthrough. I watched him do it 3 times before the Morrison case. I watched him do it with Deshaun Kimura's 3-year fraud investigation in 2016. I watched him do it with the Pelham arson series in 2018. Both times, the detective who actually broke the case received a departmental letter of commendation and a certificate that went in a frame somewhere, and Harmon got quoted in the newspaper. He was not cruel about it. He never openly said, "My work is his." He simply moved the paper in a way that put his name at the top and let everything else sort itself out from there. Rosa used to call it administrative gravity. Things fall toward Jerry, she said. It is a law of the building. Rosa Delgado was my closest friend in the department and had been since 2011, when we were both assigned to a multi-agency task force on a human trafficking case and spent 3 weeks driving each other around in unmarked cars and discovering we had the same terrible opinion of the same people. Rosa retired in 2021, 3 years before me. She was the person who organized my retirement party, booked Caruso's, called Marcus, sent the invitations. She told me later that Harmon had asked to speak at the event, and she had said, "Of course, because what else do you say to your friend's boss when he makes that kind of request?" She said she was sorry for that. I told her not to be. I said it would have happened one way or another, and at least at Caruso's, the chicken was decent. The Morrison case came to me in March of 2022. I had been in cold cases for 14 years by then. I had worked or contributed to 31 cases, 11 of which resulted in arrests and convictions, 7 of which resulted in identified remains being returned to families, and 13 of which remained open with new information cataloged for future investigation. I knew my own record. I had it memorized in the way you memorize things you never get to say out loud. The Morrison file was 3 inches thick when it landed on my desk. Sandra Morrison had disappeared on a Thursday evening in October of 2003. She was 41 years old, a school teacher, married for 12 years, mother of 1 daughter who was 4 years old at the time. She left her school at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon and was never seen again. Her car was found at a shopping mall parking lot 6 miles from the school. Her purse was in the car. Her keys were in her purse. Nothing was missing. She simply did not come home. The original investigation in 2003 had focused heavily on the husband, which is procedure in spousal disappearance cases and not unreasonable. He was cleared within 6 months. The investigation expanded and then contracted and then expanded again and then essentially stopped in 2007 when the lead detective retired. The file had been opened and closed by 4 different detectives in the 15 years between 2007 and 2022. Each one had documented their review, noted a few new angles, and ultimately put the file back in the cabinet. I understand why. The physical evidence was limited. The witness pool had aged and scattered. The husband had remarried, moved to another state, and declined to participate in subsequent interviews. There was a sense about the file that it had been exhausted. I did not believe that. My experience with cold cases is that no file is exhausted. A file is only as exhausted as the last person who looked at it was tired. I started from the beginning. I read every page of the original investigation, every interview transcript, every evidence log, every note in every margin. I made a list of everyone who had been interviewed, and I noted what each interview had covered and, more importantly, what it had not covered. I had a yellow legal pad that I kept separate from the official file, and on that pad, I wrote questions. Not observations, not theories, questions. Why was Sandra Morrison driving to that particular shopping mall when she had told her department head she was going straight home? Why had the security footage from the mall parking lot in 2003 shown her car arriving but not showed her walking anywhere? who had been in contact with her in the 3 weeks before she disappeared. There were 44 questions on my legal pad by the end of the first week. I was on question 17 before I found the thing that nobody had noticed. There was a woman named Agnes Pollard listed in the original 2003 interview log. She was 61 years old at the time of Sandra Morrison's disappearance, and she lived 2 streets from the mall where Sandra's car was found. She had been interviewed once, briefly, by a patrol officer, and her statement said she had not seen anything unusual on the Thursday in question. The interview was 4 lines long. No follow-up was ever conducted. I looked at Agnes Pollard's name for a long time. 4 lines for a neighbor in a missing persons case felt thin to me. I pulled her address from the original report. I looked it up. Agnes Pollard was still alive, still at the same address. She was 79 years old. I called 3 times before she picked up. She had a sharp voice, the voice of someone who spent years in a profession that required precision. I told her who I was and what I was calling about. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she had been waiting for someone to call again about that case. She said the officer who came to her door in 2003 had not stayed long enough to hear what she actually had to say. I drove 3 hours to Agnes Pollard's house on a Tuesday morning in May of 2022. My back was in a moderate phase that week, which means I stopped once at a rest area to stand beside my car for 10 minutes and let the compression brace do its job before I got back in. Agnes Pollard lived in a small brick house with a garden in front that she clearly still maintained herself. She was a small woman with white hair pulled back and reading glasses on top of her head. She offered me tea. I said yes. We sat at her kitchen table and she talked for 2 hours and 12 minutes, and I recorded every word with her permission, and I also wrote everything down because I have always found that writing something down and recording it are 2 separate acts of memory, and both of them matter. What Agnes Pollard told me that day changed the direction of the Morrison investigation completely. She had not told the patrol officer in 2003 because he had not asked the right questions, and she had not understood that what she knew was relevant. She had been watching from her front window on the Thursday afternoon in question because she was waiting for a delivery. She had seen Sandra Morrison's car turn into the parking lot across from her house, which was a small lot for a dry cleaner, not the shopping mall lot 6 miles away where the car was eventually found. She had seen Sandra get out of the car. She had seen her get into another car. She had seen that car drive away. She had not called the police because she did not know Sandra Morrison and did not know the car and did not know until 3 days later when she saw the news report that the woman she had watched get into a car had been reported missing. By then, a week had passed and she was not sure it was connected, and she did not want to bother anyone. The patrol officer who came to her door had asked only whether she had seen anything unusual near the mall parking lot 6 miles away. That lot was not visible from Agnes Pollard's house. She had answered honestly, and he had moved on. I want to pause here and say something about Agnes Pollard specifically, because I think about her often, and I think the world does not adequately appreciate the particular kind of person she represents. She was a retired school teacher who had spent 40 years drilling information into young people in a way that made it retrievable. Her memory was precise, not because she was remarkable in some exceptional way, but because she had spent her whole professional life treating detail as something that mattered. She remembered the color of the other car because she had trained herself to observe. She remembered the partial plate number because she habitually read plates the way other people read license plates on road trips, as a reflex born of years of paying attention. She had held this information for 19 years without knowing whether it was relevant, and the moment I asked the right question, she gave it to me cleanly and completely. The right question had taken 19 years to arrive because no one had driven 3 hours to ask it. I am not saying this to make myself sound important. I am saying it because it is the truth of how cold cases work. They wait for someone who is willing to make the drive. Agnes Pollard had a memory for details that I have rarely encountered in 30 years of interviews. She remembered the color of the other car. She remembered the partial plate number, 3 characters, because she had a habit of reading plates without meaning to. She remembered approximately what time it was. She remembered that Sandra Morrison had not looked frightened. She had walked to the other car calmly, without being led or pressured, and she had gotten in without hesitation. That last detail was significant. Agnes Pollard said the woman walked like she was going to a meeting she had scheduled herself. She said she thought at the time it was a friend picking her up because her own car had broken down. She said she had never thought about it again until the news report 3 days later, and by then she had already half convinced herself she was misremembering. I came home from Agnes Pollard's house with 2 hours and 12 minutes of recording and 9 pages of handwritten notes and the partial plate number written in a circle at the top of the page with 3 stars next to it. I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. Marcus was making dinner. He asked how my day was. I said productive. He asked if anything interesting happened. I said I had a good interview. He nodded and went back to the stove. I ate dinner and then I sat at the kitchen table until midnight, running the partial plate through every combination I could cross-reference against vehicle registrations in the surrounding counties in 2003, filtering by color, filtering by model type based on Agnes Pollard's description, filtering by geographic proximity to the scene. I had 14 candidates by midnight. By 2 in the morning, I had it down to 3. I went to bed. I got up at 5:30 because my back was done sleeping even if I was not, and I made coffee, and I sat back down, and I worked the 3 remaining candidates until one of them resolved. The name that came back was not in the original case file anywhere. It was not connected to Sandra Morrison in any documented way. It was a man named Carl Whitfield, who had lived in a town called Belford, 11 miles from the dry cleaner lot in 2003, and who had a vehicle matching Agnes Pollard's description registered in his name. I need to be precise here about what I had. I had a partial plate match, a vehicle description match, a location match, and a witness statement that placed a vehicle of that type at that location at approximately that time. I did not have a connection between Whitfield and Morrison. I did not have physical evidence. What I had was the beginning of a thread and 20 years of experience telling me to pull it. I pulled it for 4 more weeks. I documented everything. I filed every report in the case management system. I kept my personal copies in a blue accordion folder that I stored in my desk drawer at home, the one with the sticky hinge that Marcus had been asking me to fix for 2 years. Carl Whitfield had moved twice since 2003. He had a record. Nothing violent in the official history, but there were 2 restraining orders filed by 2 different women in the mid-1990s that had expired without incident. He had been employed at a private tutoring company in 2003. I pulled the tutoring company's client list from their archived business records, which took a subpoena and 3 weeks and a lot of patience with a records department that had been digitizing files from 20 years ago in a way that suggested they were doing it during lunch breaks. Sandra Morrison had been a client of that tutoring company. Her daughter's tutoring sessions had been billed to the Morrison household for 9 months in 2002 and 2003. Carl Whitfield had been the assigned tutor. I had a connection. It was documented. It was in the case management system, under my name, my badge number, my signature on every attached report. I briefed Lieutenant Harmon in a formal case review on the afternoon of June 2nd, 2022. The review lasted 45 minutes. He listened carefully. He asked good questions. He said I had done excellent work and that he wanted to take this forward to the captain in a full case review the following week. He asked me to prepare a summary document and to send it to him so he could review it before the meeting. I prepared the summary document. I sent it to him. I continued working the case in the meantime. I was not in the room for the meeting with Captain Knowles the following week. I found out about that later. I had assumed I would be presenting. Harmon told me the meeting had been scheduled during a time I had a court appearance for a different case, which was true, and he said he would represent the findings on my behalf. I thought that was normal procedure. I had seen it done before. I went to my court appearance. I came back. Harmon stopped by my office late that afternoon and told me the captain had authorized a full investigative expansion on the Morrison case and that he, Harmon, would be heading the expanded team. He said I would remain involved. He said my initial work had been crucial and that it would be properly documented. I said, thank you. He said I deserved it. He seemed genuinely pleased. I did not know yet what properly documented meant in his operational language. I worked the Morrison case for 10 more months after that meeting. I was not removed from the file, but things changed in ways that were subtle enough that I told myself I was imagining them. The case management entries started coming from Harmon's login. Reports that I wrote and submitted would reappear in the official file with formatting changes and Harmon's name in the header. My interview notes were transcribed into official format and filed without my name on them. When a second witness was located in August of 2022, a former colleague of Whitfield's who had information about his behavior with clients, I conducted the interview. I wrote the report, I submitted it, and I watched it disappear into the file under someone else's attribution. I kept my personal copies in the blue accordion folder. By the end, I had 43 pages of personal copies. I did not know what I was going to do with them. I kept them because Dwight Calloway had told me to 11 years earlier, and Dwight had been right about things before. Carl Whitfield was arrested in December of 2022. He was charged with the murder of Sandra Morrison after a search of a property he had owned in 2003 turned up physical evidence that the expanded investigation had located based on information developed from my original witness interviews. The case went to trial in 2023. Whitfield was convicted in March of 2024. 21 years after Sandra Morrison disappeared, I was not called to testify. The witnesses I had found were called. The records I had traced were entered into evidence. My name was in the case file in the official capacity of contributing investigator, which is a classification that means something different in the documentation than it means to a human being reading it. The press conference after the conviction featured Lieutenant Gerald Harmon standing beside Captain Knowles. The statement credited the department's cold case unit with a thorough, multi-year investigation. I watched it on television in my living room. Marcus came in halfway through and asked what I was watching. I said news. He sat down for a minute and then got up to get a glass of water, and I heard him in the kitchen running the tap. Rosa called me the next morning. She did not ask me how I was feeling. She said, I know. I said, I know, you know? She said, come over and we will be appropriately angry about it for exactly 2 hours and then we will have lunch. I went over. We were appropriately angry. We had lunch. Rosa has a way of being furious on someone's behalf without making you feel like a victim, which is a specific and valuable skill. She said she had seen it happen 3 times in her career. She said the pattern was always the same. She said the only thing that ever broke the pattern was outside pressure, meaning someone who was not in the department and did not owe the department anything deciding to name things correctly. She said she was not predicting that would happen. She was just saying. I said I understood. I drove home. My back was bad that week because the weather had changed, and pressure fronts do something to my lower vertebrae that I cannot fully explain, but that I have learned to predict. I wore the brace all the way home, and I sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Not because I was thinking about anything in particular, just because the car was easier on my back than most chairs. My retirement was scheduled for February of 2024. I had put in for it the previous fall at 57, which is a year earlier than I had planned. The honest reason is that I was tired in a way that rest was not going to fix. Not tired of the work. I was never tired of the work. I was tired of the work being absorbed into a system that would not acknowledge it. I had 30 years and 11 convictions and 7 families who had buried someone because of my hours and my yellow legal pads and my habit of driving 3 hours to sit across from a 79-year-old woman and let her tell me what she saw from her front window 20 years ago. None of that was going to be on any document that anyone would read. I knew that before I put in my retirement papers. I knew it the way you know things about your own life that you have spent years refusing to look at directly. My last day at the department was a Thursday in late January. I came in early, which is my habit, and I spent 4 hours at my desk clearing a lifetime of accumulation into 3 cardboard boxes. Cold case detectives are not known for minimalism. We keep things. I had case notes going back to 2008 in physical form, organized by year and then by case number in a system that made complete sense to me and would have made no sense to anyone else. I kept what was mine by hand and what was mine by memory, and I left behind everything that belonged to the department. The sticky 3rd drawer on the filing cabinet I left open, as a small and private gesture of refusal. Whoever sat at that desk next could deal with it themselves. Dwight's advice about the triplicate copies had produced, over 16 years, a collection of personal records that I stored in a series of blue accordion folders in the bottom left drawer of my desk at home. I had 43 pages from the Morrison case alone. I had similar personal copies from 14 other investigations where my contribution had been absorbed or minimized or simply never properly attributed. I had not read them in months. I did not read them on my last day either. There is a kind of documentation you keep not because you plan to use it, but because you cannot bear for it not to exist somewhere. Because the alternative is a world where those 14 months belonged entirely to Gerald Harmon, and I was not willing to live in that world even when I had no plan to change it. I said goodbye to the people who were in the office that morning. Most of them gave me handshakes or brief hugs and said things that were sincere and general. One younger detective, a woman named Carla, who had transferred into cold cases 8 months earlier, stopped me in the hallway and said she wanted me to know that she had read some of my case narratives in the archive and that they were the clearest thinking she had seen in the unit. She said she hoped she would eventually be half as thorough. I said I hope the same thing, but from experience, the system was not going to make it easy. She looked at me for a moment and then said she had already noticed that. I said, good. I said, noticing it early is better than being surprised by it later. She nodded. I picked up my first cardboard box and carried it to my car. My back complained on the third trip, as it always does when I am carrying something at an awkward angle, and I stood by the trunk for a moment and breathed steadily until it settled. The compression brace was doing its job. It has always done its job. It is reliable in the way that a great many useful things in my life have been reliable without receiving any particular credit for it. Marcus threw a retirement party. I told him not to. He told me he was going to anyway. I told him to keep it small. He invited 47 people, which is his definition of small and not mine. He booked Caruso's on 5th because it was close to the department, and he thought people would appreciate not having to drive. He ordered the chicken marsala for the table because he remembered I had liked it there years ago. He arranged the tables and the centerpieces and the little printed menus himself. He stood at the door greeting people for the first 45 minutes, while I sat and talked to the officers and support staff who had come. Some of them people I had worked with for decades, some of them newer faces who knew me only by reputation or not at all. Rosa was there. She was at the table directly to my left, close enough that I could hear her talking and could tell from the sound of her voice when she was watching something she did not like. Harmon arrived at 7. He came in with the deputy commissioner, which should have told me something. He found me at my table and shook my hand and said it was a hell of a career, Williams, a hell of a career. He meant it sincerely. That is the complicated thing about Jerry Harmon. He is not a man who takes pleasure in diminishing you. He simply lives in a world where credit and attribution are resources to be managed, and he manages them in his favor the way other people manage their calendars. He is not thinking about what you lost. He is thinking about what he needs. The distinction does not change the outcome, but it changes how you understand the person you are looking at. When Harmon walked to the podium 20 minutes later and began to speak, I picked up my fork. I want to be clear about that. I made a deliberate choice to eat my dinner. I had known since the night of the conviction press conference that this moment was coming in some form. The retirement party was the obvious venue. Harmon was going to stand up and describe the Morrison case because the Morrison case was the biggest thing the cold case unit had done in a decade, and it was a retirement party. And tribute speeches at retirement parties always mention the biggest case. I had made my peace with this in the same way you make your peace with a bad knee. You do not make it stop hurting. You just decide in advance how you are going to carry yourself when it does. He spoke for 20 minutes. He described Sandra Morrison's disappearance accurately and with genuine feeling. He described the investigative challenges honestly. He described the breakthrough witness interview, meaning Agnes Pollard, and he got the details correct. He described the vehicle records work correctly. He described the connection to the tutoring company correctly. He described the arrest and conviction correctly. Every single element he described was something I had documented in a report he had then filed under his oversight. Every single word he said was accurate. My name was not mentioned once. Marcus leaned over after about 12 minutes and whispered that Harmon seemed to know the case extremely well. I said yes. He does. I ate my chicken. I watched the clock. Rosa, at the table to my left, had gone very still. I could see her from the corner of my eye. She had put down her fork and she was watching Harmon with the specific expression she reserves for things she cannot change in the moment but is storing for later. I appreciated her for that. I appreciated that she was angry so that I did not have to be. Not right then, not in public, not with Marcus next to me hearing for the first time the shape of a story I had never told him properly. The speech ended to applause. Marcus clapped. He is a generous man in social situations, reflexively warm, and he was surrounded by my colleagues applauding, so he applauded too. Then he turned to me and he asked, in a low voice, what my involvement was exactly. I said I worked the file. He looked at me for a moment. He said yes, but was I the main detective on it? I said I found the first witness. He said, that sounded important. I said it was. He asked why Harmon had not mentioned me. I said that is a longer conversation. He said we should have it. I said yes, we should. We did not have it that night. The dinner continued. People came to my table. People said kind things. Colleagues told me they had always respected my work, which I believed because they had said similar things in smaller rooms over the years when it cost them nothing to say it and nothing to hold back. Dwight Calloway, who had retired 5 years earlier, came in around 8:30 and hugged me and said he was sorry he was late and that he had brought me something. He put a small bottle of good bourbon on the table and said every cold case detective deserves a drink that does not come from a gas station. I laughed for the first time all evening. Rosa refilled both our glasses. Marcus talked to Dwight for a while, and I could see from across the table that he liked Dwight immediately, which made sense, because Dwight is the kind of man who is easy to like quickly. It was getting close to 9:30. The evening was winding down. Harmon had left an hour earlier, after spending time at several tables, working the room in the manner of a man who has been working rooms for 30 years and finds it natural. The deputy commissioner had left with him. People were gathering coats. Marcus was talking to Rosa about the logistics of getting my things from the department the following week. I was sitting at table 4 with my second cup of coffee, watching the restaurant empty slowly, doing the quiet arithmetic of a career ended that anyone does at the end of the last evening. That is when I saw her. She was standing near the back of the restaurant, close to the coat check, and she had been there for at least 20 minutes because I had noticed her when she came in and had registered her as a guest of one of my colleagues. She was in her late 20s, dark hair, wearing a black dress that was appropriate for a dinner function but not celebratory. She was holding a manila envelope at her side with both hands, not casually, the way you hold something you have been careful with. She was watching my table. When the last colleague at my table stood up to leave and I was sitting alone with my coffee, she walked across the restaurant. She walked the way you walk when you have rehearsed the walk in your head many times and you are finally doing it. She stopped at the edge of table 4. She said, I am sorry to approach you this way, Detective Williams. She said, I have been trying to find you for 5 years. She said her name was Maya. She said her mother's name was Sandra. I put down my coffee cup. I looked at her. I said, please sit down. She sat. She placed the manila envelope on the table between us, but did not open it. She said she was 27 years old and that she had been 4 years old when her mother disappeared. She said she had grown up knowing her mother's case had never been solved and that she had spent most of her adult life reading everything publicly available about the investigation. She said when Whitfield was convicted in March, she had begun looking for the detective whose work had actually built the case because the press coverage attributed everything to Harmon and she had a reason to believe that was not accurate. I asked her what her reason was. She looked at me steadily. She was not nervous. She was the kind of calm that comes from having prepared for a conversation so thoroughly that the conversation itself is just the execution of a plan. She said that in January, a woman named Ethel Crane had contacted her. Ethel Crane had worked in the department's records division for 22 years and had retired in the fall of 2023. She had been responsible for archiving and filing in the cold case unit for the last 9 of those years. She had watched how case documentation moved through the system. She had, over those 9 years, developed a precise and detailed understanding of whose work became whose report. She had seen it happen before the Morrison case. She had seen it during. When she retired, she took nothing with her that was not hers to take. But before she left, she had made copies of certain original reports that existed in the physical file before the digital versions were created. Reports that bore original signatures, reports that showed what the documentation looked like before administrative revisions. She had kept those copies because she believed the record deserved to exist somewhere. She had not known what to do with them. Then Whitfield was convicted and she watched the press conference and she made her decision. Ethel Crane had sent Maya Morrison a packet in the mail. The packet contained photocopies. Photocopies of original reports filed in the Morrison case between March and September of 2022. Reports detailing the Agnes Pollard interview. Reports detailing the vehicle records search. reports detailing the connection to the tutoring company. Each report bore a header. Each report bore a badge number. Each report bore a signature at the bottom of the final page. Maya Morrison opened the manila envelope. She placed the photocopies on the table at Caruso's on 5th, in front of me, at 9:47 on the evening of my retirement party. She placed them one at a time, carefully, in the order they had been filed. The signature at the bottom of each page was mine. My badge number was mine. My name was mine. The handwriting in the margins of the interview notes was mine. Every piece of it was mine. I looked at the pages for a long time without picking them up. Marcus had come back to the table without my noticing. He had come back to ask me if I was ready to go, and he had found a young woman in a black dress placing documents in front of his wife, and he had stopped and stood very still. I looked up at him. He looked at the papers. He looked at the young woman. He sat down. He picked up the first page. He read it slowly. He is not a law enforcement reader. He is an accountant, and he reads the way accountants read, with attention to every detail and a particular alertness to numbers and identifiers. He read my badge number. He read my name in the header. He read my signature. He put the page down and picked up the second one. He read the second one. He put it down and read the third. By the time he finished the fourth page, he had gone very quiet in a way that I recognized, the way he goes quiet when he is processing something that has changed the shape of a thing he thought he understood. He put the fourth page down. He looked at me. He did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How many of them are there?" I said, "There are 31 original reports in the Morrison file from that period." He said, "Are they all like this?" I said, "The signature and badge number are on all of them." He said, "And Harmon knew." I said, "He reorganized the documentation through his oversight permissions in the case management system. The originals were physical copies that got filed and then superseded by digital versions with different header information." Marcus looked at me. He said, "For how long?" I said, "The first time I noticed it happening was 2016. He absorbed that. He said the year we went to his sister's house for Christmas and I had called him from the parking lot saying I would be 2 more hours because I was working a file. He said the year he told the people at the Christmas party that I was in records management. I said yes. He said that I had never corrected him. I said no, I had not. He said, "Why not?" I looked at him and I did not have an answer that was not also a kind of accusation, because the truth is that I had known for a long time that he did not understand what I did, and I had chosen not to push past his assumptions, because pushing past them would have required me to insist on my own significance in a way I had never been trained to do. I had 30 years of not insisting on my own significance. It had become structural. I did not know how to be without it. Rosa had appeared at the edge of the table. She looked at the papers. She looked at Maya. She looked at me. She pulled out a chair and sat down. She said she was going to need someone to explain this from the beginning. Maya explained it. Rosa listened without interrupting, which is unusual for Rosa and means she was taking the situation very seriously. When Maya finished, Rosa looked at the papers again, and then she said, "Ethel Crane." She said it the way you say the name of someone you underestimated. She said she had known Ethel for years. She said Ethel had always been exacting and principled, and that she had clearly been waiting for the right use for that exactness. Dwight Calloway was still at a nearby table finishing his bourbon. He had been listening since Maya sat down, not because he was eavesdropping, but because his table was close and the room had emptied enough that sound carried. He stood up and walked over. He put his hand on my shoulder briefly and said nothing. He did not need to. Dwight had told me in 2008 to keep personal copies of everything. He had known what kind of department we were in. He had tried to prepare me, and I had done the thing he advised without fully understanding why, and that preparation was now sitting on a table in a restaurant, 31 pages of it, in front of my husband and my friend and the daughter of a woman I had spent 14 months trying to find justice for. Marcus asked Maya what she intended to do with the copies. Maya said she had already sent a set to her attorney. She said she was considering whether to make a statement to the press. She said she had come tonight because she wanted to meet the detective who had actually found her mother's killer before she did anything else. She said she had come because she wanted to say it to me directly, in person, so that it existed as a real thing that had been said out loud in front of witnesses. She said, Detective Williams, you found my mother. You found the man who took her from me and from my father and from everyone who loved her. That finding was yours. She said, I wanted you to know that I know. I do not have a gift for the kind of moments where someone says something that goes directly to the thing you have been carrying. I am better in motion. I am better with a legal pad and a pen and a 3-hour drive and a cup of tea at a kitchen table. But I was sitting at table 4 and there was nowhere to be in motion to, and this young woman in her black dress had driven to this restaurant with a manila envelope and waited at the back for an hour and a half to say that to me, and I had nothing to say back that was adequate. I said thank you. I said her mother had been worth every minute of it. I said I was glad she knew the truth. Maya nodded. She did not cry, which made me feel better, because if she had cried, I would have too, and I had eaten my chicken with considerable composure, and I was not ready to abandon it now. I looked at my husband. He was looking at the papers on the table with the expression of a man doing a long calculation that he should have started years ago. He looked up at me. He said, 30 years. I said yes. He said, 30 years, and I gave speeches about administrative paperwork. I said, you gave the speeches I let you give. He said that was not an acceptable answer. I said, I know. He said, we are going to talk about this. I said, I know. He said he was sorry. I said the apology I needed was not from him. He said he was sorry anyway. I said, all right. He reached across the table and took my hand. He held it for a moment. Then he picked up the papers again and kept reading. We stayed at Caruso's until the staff began to diplomatically rearrange the chairs around us. Rosa walked out with us and stood in the parking lot, and we talked for a while, in the way old colleagues talk at the end of things, in shorthand and silences and the occasional burst of accurate and impolite honesty. Rosa said she thought Ethel Crane deserved some kind of recognition. I said I agreed. Rosa said she thought someone should send Ethel a very good bottle of wine. I said I knew someone with good bourbon. Dwight, still in his coat, raised his remaining glass from where he was standing 3 feet away. Maya had left before us, quietly, with a card that had her attorney's contact information on it and a handshake that lasted a second longer than most handshakes do. I drove home with Marcus. The drive was mostly silent. My back had stiffened from sitting for 3 hours, and I was aware of it as a low, persistent complaint, the same complaint I had been carrying for 15 years. And I thought about how a body keeps its own record of the work it did in a way that no one can edit or file under a different name. Marcus drove because he always drives when my back is bad. Without being asked, without making it a thing. He knows the route. We got home a little after 11. I took off the compression brace in the front hall and hung it on the hook by the door where I always hung it, and Marcus went to the kitchen and put the kettle on because he knows I always want tea after a long evening, and I do not know how to ask for things I need, so I rely on him knowing. I sat at the kitchen table. I put the manila envelope on the chair beside me. I thought about Agnes Pollard and her small brick house with her garden and her precise memory and her years of not knowing that what she had seen from her window mattered. I thought about Sandra Morrison walking calmly across a dry cleaner parking lot toward a car she trusted because the man driving it had spent 9 months sitting across a table from her daughter. I thought about Maya Morrison being 4 years old and then 27, and spending the space in between learning to hold the weight of an unanswered question. I thought about Ethel Crane, working in records, watching documents move, keeping copies for 9 years because the record deserved to exist somewhere. I thought about 30 years of yellow legal pads and 3-hour drives and triplicate forms and a filing cabinet with a sticky third drawer. Marcus set a cup of tea in front of me. He sat down across the table. He said, "Tell me about the Morrison case. Tell me about all of them." I said, "That was a lot of ground to cover." He said, "I know." He said, "We have time." He said he was not going anywhere, and neither was I, and he wanted the real version. He said he had been given the short version for 26 years by both of us, and he did not want the short version anymore. I looked at him. I put my hands around the cup. My back ached. The tea was good. The kitchen was quiet. I said, "All right." I said, "Let me start with the Morrison case, and we will work backwards from there." I said, "The first thing you need to know is about a woman named Agnes Pollard." I said Agnes Pollard was 61 years old when she watched something from her front window that she did not understand was important until 3 days later, and she had been waiting 20 years for someone to come back and ask her what she actually saw. Marcus leaned forward. He was listening the way he read those reports. carefully, with full attention. The way he should have been listening for years and the way I should have been speaking for years. And we were both doing it now in our kitchen at 11:30 at night on the evening of my retirement, which was not the right time, except that it was the only time we had. I talked for 2 hours. He did not look away once. I have thought many times since that night about what it means to do work that disappears, not work that fails, work that succeeds and is then absorbed into a record that erases you from it. There is a particular discipline required to keep doing that work. I am not sure it is a virtue, exactly. It is more like a stubbornness, a refusal to stop building something even when the building keeps getting attributed to someone else. I do not know if I was right to be that stubborn. I know that Sandra Morrison's family has their answer. I know that Maya Morrison knows who found her mother. I know that Ethel Lacrane made her copies and kept them for 9 years and chose her moment well. I know that Dwight Calloway told me in 2008 to file everything in triplicate and keep a personal copy, and I know now that he had seen exactly this pattern before and was trying to give me the one tool that could not be overwritten. The copies in the manila envelope are with my attorney now. I do not know what will happen with them. That is not something I am managing. What I know is that they exist. What I know is that they have been seen. What I know is that on the evening of my retirement, my husband heard my name attached to the right story for the first time in 26 years, and he heard it from a young woman in a black dress who spent 5 years finding me because she understood that the truth is too important to leave in the wrong file. My back still hurts. The brace still goes on the hook by the door. The third drawer on my filing cabinet at home still sticks. I wake up early because my body has decided that is what it does now. And I make coffee, and I sit at the kitchen table with my yellow legal pad, and sometimes I write down questions that I do not have a case to answer. And I think about Agnes Pollard in her garden and Sandra Morrison walking across a parking a lot in October of 2003 with her whole life still ahead of her, and the particular weight of knowing that 20 years was too long and also the only time it was going to take. I am not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that. I was angry for a long time. I was angry in the specific way of someone who has been doing a thing correctly and invisibly and has watched that correctness be harvested by someone who did not plant it. That anger is real and it was mine, and I am not going to pretend it was not. But I am past it now, in the way you get past the weather. It rained. It was cold. Then it was over, and the ground remembered every drop of it, whether you marked it down or not. 30 years of doing the work nobody sees does not disappear because one man put his name on the file. The truth has its own filing system. It keeps everything forever.